welcome everyone to this week's CCL training program. It's a weekly webinar of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provides CCL supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics related to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'll be your host tonight, Brett Cease, and tonight's topic is going to be exploring what the modeling says about the Energy Permitting Reform Act. We're going to join CCL's research coordinator, Dana Nuccitelli, for a training that's going to provide updates to what the emission reductions potentials is, specifically for the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024, based on modeling by Resources for the Future, RMI, Third Way, Jesse Jenkins, you name it. The whole climate modeling Avengers team has been assembled, and we're going to find out about what their findings are. We have with us the wonderful Dana Nuccitelli, CCL's research coordinator, an environmental scientist by day, a climate journalist by night. Dana writes for Yale Climate Connections and has been the 2022 SEAL Award winner, as well as the author of 10 peer-reviewed climate science papers. We're so glad, amongst many of your other achievements, Dana, to have you joining and walking us through this tonight. And if we've done our job well here in the next hour together, we're going to walk away with the following 3 learning goals. We want to make sure to explore explicitly some more of the provisions and details of the actual legislation, what's in the Energy Permitting Reform Act. We most importantly want to use the updated climate models to start figuring out the effect that this bill will have on climate pollution. And that's specifically what Dana is going to be walking through tonight. And throughout it all, we'll also make sure to highlight why CCL is supporting it, what's next for the act in Congress, and a couple of the other key details that you might be curious about. And I will pass it to you, Dana. Thanks so much for joining us.
Cool. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So let's start with a quick review of what's in the Energy Permitting Reform Act. We did have a previous CCU about a month and a half ago that went into this in more detail. So check that out. Also check out the forums for more detail. But basically it had some provisions to accelerate the permitting of electrical transmission lines, which is super important for getting more clean energy on the grid. It had some provisions to get more clean energy on federal lands, a few judicial reforms and community engagement reforms, although we'd like to see more of the community engagement reforms especially. Some measures to make domestic mining more feasible, some fossil fuel stuff to make more federal land lease sales for oil and gas, also for renewable projects, and some provisions to expedite LNG, liquefied natural gas export terminal permits. So we're going to be talking about each of those provisions, or most of them. And so the first CCU training we did on this, I was talking about, we need to get some expert modelers to analyze the emissions impacts of all these different provisions. And 1 week ago, we got that all together in this one report compiled by Third Way, quantifying the emission impacts of the Energy Permitting Reform Act. So we had these 4 different groups, RFF, Resources for Future, RMI, Jesse Jenkins at Princeton Zero Lab, and Third Way, which Third Way then compiled all of these modeling results into this one report. So very cool. These are all really good, expert, well-respected energy modelers. Our social media team made this nice graphic showing illustrating them as like the super team, the climate energy modeling Avengers, because we're really lucky to have all of these expert, well-respected, really good modeling groups modeling this one bill that we're very interested in, this very important bill. And so also they did a very, very thorough job, as we'll see, as we'll go through each of their analyses. It took them, over a month to get this done. So they made sure to, dot their I's and cross their T's and do a good and thorough job. And we really appreciate all their work on this. So this is kind of our bottom line graphic. So you can see going from left to right, RFF modeled the impacts of the onshore oil and gas leasing on emissions. Third Way did the offshore oil and gas leasing provisions. Jesse Jenkins at Princeton Zero Lab did the LNG export provisions, and RMI did the electric transmission provisions. So you can see the fossil fuel provisions have a positive, as in increasing, but relatively small effect on greenhouse gas emissions. The transmission provisions have a negative, meaning decreasing emissions. effect, and a quite significantly large one in all likelihood. And so we're getting anywhere from a small decrease to a very large decrease in US greenhouse gas emissions between 2030 and 2050. And we'll go through all of these and then put this all into context here in the next few minutes. So let's start with the transmission stuff, because this is the stuff we are particularly interested in to get this clean energy transition going faster. So one provision in there had interregional transmission planning, which we're familiar with from the Big Wires Act that we have advocated for. The main difference is that while it has each region of the country create plans to increase interregional transmission, connecting transmission lines so we can exchange electricity between regions of the country. There's no minimum requirement. Like in the Big Wires Act, it said you have to do something like 30% of your peak load. So like the most electricity you need in a given year, you have to be able to exchange 30% of that amount with your neighbors. There's no minimum requirement in this bill. It's just like you have to do some planning. It gave FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or it would give FERC authority over permitting of big, important interstate transmission lines. Just is a one-step process. So currently the way it works is that if you want to build a big transmission line that's going to cross multiple states, you have to get permits in each individual state and locality. This would just let FERC take over as a one-stop shop, and FERC would coordinate with the states and local authorities. Currently, we're trying to make this happen using existing law, but there's an extra step that the Department of Energy has to designate an area as a national interest corridor, which basically means like the DOE says this particular area would really benefit from a big new transmission line. It would be in the national interest. And so we're going to designate that, and then FERC gets the authority over the permitting potentially of that transmission line. So this kind of takes that step out. Which also avoids any duplication in the like environmental assessments between the DOE and the FERC. Like as it is right now, they might have to do duplicative evaluations. So kind of takes the DOE out and just says a project applicant can say, FERC, I think my transmission line is in the national interest. You should help me permit it. And FERC can say, yeah, you're right, we'll do that. And we don't have to have the DOE involved. And so it's a more streamlined and efficient process with less duplication, less red tape. And then the other thing is that there is an agreement on how to allocate costs of these transmission lines, because there's often these long extended fights over who's going to pay for how much. That really delays projects quite a bit. And so this is basically like it creates sort of like a formula that everybody agrees to, that you pay proportional to how much you benefit from the line. And so that also saves time. So as I mentioned, RMI modeled those transmission provisions' impact on greenhouse gas emissions. They have these three kind of summary points. They said these provisions, along with FERC's Order 1920, which is this rule that FERC put out to improve regional transmission planning. Together, those would accelerate transmission expansion by 2 to 4% over today's rate, or 2 to 4 times over today's rates, which is a nice improvement that we like to see. They found that new transmission that would be built would help the U.S. grid deploy large amounts of clean energy. Excellent. Helping to meet expected load growth, which is really important because we're seeing more and more electricity demand from data centers, artificial intelligence, electrification of vehicles, electrification of buildings. We know demand's going to go up. And so we want to meet that demand with clean energy. So this would help with that. Also good. And also displace existing fossil fuel electricity generation. Also very important. So all good stuff. And they estimate, in their best estimate, that the Energy Permitting Reform Act would help build clean energy that would reduce grid emissions by 6.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent cumulatively through 2050. I will put that into context because 6.5 gigatons probably means nothing to most people. It didn't mean a whole lot to me. I had to kind of figure out how that related to like our overall emissions. And so we'll get to that soon. I think it's useful to bear in mind that RMI made some pretty conservative assumptions in coming up with these numbers, because I mean, modeling is always tricky, especially when you're modeling like people's behavior. People are hard to predict. And so what we know is that the bill will make transmission lines faster to permit. We don't know exactly how much faster. And we also don't know how fast these regional grid operators will actually build transmission lines, because they might not build them as fast as is like humanly and permittingly possible. And so I think RMI took a pretty smart approach. And they said they looked at MISO, which is the mid-continent system operator in like the center of the country, basically, the grid operator there. And MISO has been building transmission lines very fast recently, very aggressively, because they decided that was a smart thing to do. They're doing a very good job. And so RMI said, let's look at the rate at which they're building transmission lines in MISO, and we'll assume that the average of the rest of the country's transmission regions will build them half as fast as MISO, because MISO is going really fast. We'll take that as like an upper bound of how fast we can build transmission lines. Bear in mind, there's like stakeholder process limitations. Some regions, some of these grid operators are hesitant to build too much transmission too quickly because it is, it's a big investment. And so we'll say our kind of assumption is that on average, they will build half as fast as MISO has recently been building transmission lines. So that's their assumption. It's worth bearing in mind, like, that's not necessarily the case. If these transmission operators decide to be like smart and forward thinking and bear in mind, like, we need all this clean energy, we need this demand to meet this demand growth, maybe they will build transmission lines even faster, which would be even better. And so this was just kind of a assumption that they made that's maybe a little conservative, maybe it's realistic. It's hard to say. So RMI assumed that transmission growth would rise from 1% per year, 1 terawatt mile per year in recent years to 2 to 4 per year. So that's your 2 to 4 times faster transmission growth. If you look at some other reports, that's basically enough to meet a scenario where we have high renewable growth and moderate power demand growth, a moderate load scenario. So, if we have like high power demand growth, like, we might need to build transmission faster. So again, like, if we need to build transmission faster, and if we actually do that, and this bill enables that to happen, then you would have to actually, you would get more emissions reductions than the scenario that they considered. So it's a little conservative, but it's a reasonable scenario. They also assumed that the regions would only build 20% interregional transfer capacity, which I mentioned earlier. Big Wires was aiming for 30%. There was also a study of Big Wires and some other studies that have said like a minimum of 30% would be optimal for these grid operators to do. And so 20% basically means like they're going to add some interregional transmission capacity, but not as much as they probably should. And so again, that's a pretty conservative assumption. Like, if they're smart, they'll build more, which again means then you get more solar and wind and you get more emissions reductions. So that's a pretty conservative assumption in this report. And if you look at the Net Zero America report from Princeton, looking at like pathways to get us to net zero, our net zero by 2050 commitment, the transmission expansion that was assumed by RMI in this report is like half of what Net Zero America says we need by 2050. And also the Net Zero America report thinks that we'll probably need double to quadruple the total amount of power in 2050 that we need today, whereas RMI assumed that we'll just get double. And so again, it's pretty conservative. We might need to build more transmission lines and more power to meet the growth in demand. And again, if we build more transmission lines and more clean power, then you get more emissions reductions than in this scenario. So while they have significant emissions reductions, like, their scenario it's not unrealistic. It's just like a bit on the conservative side in a number of ways listed here. So then they have this little formula to calculate the emissions reductions. Here on the left, they said you're going to add so much transmission lines per year. Again, they assumed we're going to go half as fast as MISO on average. And then they said as you add transmission lines, that enables you to build a certain amount more of clean energy, mostly solar and wind. So they looked at some research and came up with this number for that. And they said the more solar and wind you build, that will displace mostly gas power, because those are the two types of power we're building right now. It's mostly solar, wind, and gas. And so the more solar and wind you build, the less gas you build. And so you're displacing gas, and that has a certain emissions reductions. So that's your formula to figure out per amount of transmission you build, here's how much emissions you reduce. And so they came up with this chart. The greenish color is the amount of regional transmission within a region they expect to be built based on their assumptions between roughly 2030 and 2050. And then they said, like, we are going to build some regional transmission regardless, like, that's already happening. And so let's just assume that basically Energy Permitting Reform Act allows us to build 30% more or like of the transmission that we build between 2030-ish and 2050, 30% of that was enabled by the Energy Permitting Reform Act. That's just kind of like an educated guess. That's a hard thing to come up with a number. It could be that, it's a bigger number. Maybe the permitting reforms allow even more transmission to be built, but that's just kind of the assumption they came up with. And then the blue is interregional transmission. Basically said like we're not doing any interregional transmission planning right now. So like any interregional transmission that gets built between now and 2030 or 2050, the Energy Permitting Reform Act gets credit for 100% of that and 100% of the emissions reductions. And so this is the emissions reductions associated with all these lines that we're building. You can see here in this scenario that they put together with these relatively conservative assumptions, it's like 14 gigawatts of emissions reduced, but again, only 30% of the regional credit goes to the Energy Permitting Reform Act provisions. And so overall, they say 6.5 gigatons of emissions is how much is avoided that the bill gets credit for. And so basically what I did was say, okay, well, how much are emissions going to change if we continue on our current emissions trajectory between now and 2050? And then how much is 6.5 gigatons of that? And that's about 8%. And that's kind of like the lower bound. But if you look at some more ambitious assumptions, which the report had like an appendix where they looked at some modeling of some more ambitious assumptions where like the amount of power load increases by 250% instead of 200%, or maybe we build that 30% interregional capacity instead of 20%. And so like in a more like aggressive, ambitious scenario, then you can actually get to like 22% cuts in emissions from our total 2030 to 2050 emissions. You can get like 22% of those from the provisions in this bill. So it's somewhere in the 8 to 22% range. It's a pretty big cut. And we'll see it in another chart form later on here. But let's move on to some of the other provisions. Let's go to the fossil fuel stuff. And just as a reminder, the bill requires at least one offshore oil and gas federal land leasing sale, and also offshore wind land leasing sale per year from 2025 to 2029. It also doesn't change necessarily the amount of onshore oil and gas federal leasing, but it does say like you have to offer up land that the oil and gas industry actually wants for leases. You can't give them like useless land. You have to let them bid on like actual good land that they want. And then on these LNG terminals, this liquefied natural gas export terminals, it basically says those that are pending, waiting for permits right now, the Department of Energy has to use existing procedures to estimate their impact on the climate and on the economy. It can't wait for the DOE to come up with some new, maybe more updated assessments to calculate that. The reason why that's relevant is that everybody probably remembers in January, the Biden administration did this pause on pending LNG export facility approvals because they said we don't want to permit any more of these facilities until we do a more accurate and thorough assessment of their impact on the climate. And so the DOE is kind of in the process of coming up with an updated way of doing that. But then in July, there was a judge that got challenged in court, and the judge said, no, you can't do that. No pause allowed. And so the pause is currently not in effect. And actually just less than 2 weeks ago, the Department of Energy issued its first LNG export permit since the pause was overturned in Mexico. Even though it's in Mexico, it uses U.S. natural gas piped down there. And so the Department of Energy still has to permit it. And so they granted that permit. And so there's already been a permit granted subsequent to the pause having been put in place. And so right now, basically, we're acting in a world where the pause is not in effect right now. So bear that in mind. And then the impact on emissions of these LNG exports is very complicated to calculate. It depends and for one thing, on what energy sources that LNG would displace, which we'll talk about here some more in a minute. And then, as we discussed previously, there was this analysis by Simon's Public Affairs, cited by Bill McKibben and a bunch of environmental groups that said it's going to cause this like carbon bomb of 165 coal power plants if we pass this bill with these provisions. But that had very unrealistic assumptions, was not a good analysis, was published like within a few hours, whereas this analysis we're talking about today, it took like over a month to do. So you can kind of see the difference in thoroughness between those different analyses. And one thing I think is worth bearing in mind is like whether these facilities that are currently pending their permits whether the bill will actually impact whether they're permitted or not. And so so I kind of did like a thought experiment, and there's kind of a nerd corner thread about it, but I'll go through the thought experiment that I did here. So first of all, we have an election in November, and it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris as our next president. And if Donald Trump wins, he's going to put people in charge of the Department of Energy who are going to approve those permits. And the election right now is 50-50. And so basically right there's a 50% chance that the terminals will be permitted right there. The good news is we'll know the results of the election before the lame duck session, before this bill is voted on. So we'll have that information in the future, but right now we don't have it. So right now it's just 50-50. So let's just say Kamala Harris is the next president. So then the question is, then what happens? And so right now, as I mentioned, the pause has been overturned. The Department of Energy is deciding whether to appeal that. So they can appeal that decision to a higher court. And then you would need a higher court to overturn that or other judge. And so maybe that'll happen, but overturning is like a harder thing to do than just like leaving it in place. And also we have to remember, if it goes up to the Supreme Court, we have a Supreme Court that is not very climate friendly. And so I would say like if the DOE decides to appeal, it's probably like less than 50% chance that they win. And so that takes us from like 50% odds to like 20% odds maybe that even if Kamala Harris is president and the DOE decides to appeal, that they will win the appeal and the pause could go back into effect. Let's say that does happen. We have President Kamala Harris, DOE appeals, they win the appeal. Then that means it's paused until they finish their assessment of the new way of calculating climate impacts of LNG export terminals. And so they do that. And then the question is, if they do that, then will they decide these terminals are not in the national interest because they have too much climate impact? And I think, as we'll see in the next slide, that's kind of like maybe 50-50, maybe even less, but we'll see why that is in the next slide. Let's call it 50-50. So then you're down to like a 10% chance that these terminals their permits are rejected. That's if Kamala Harris wins, if the DOE appeals, if the DOE wins its appeal, the DOE does the assessment and decides there's too much climate impact and these aren't in the national interest. It's a lot of like ifs that have to happen. And then another thing that could happen, like President Biden was already like negotiating with these permits because he wanted Ukraine funding. Republicans didn't want Ukraine funding, but Ukrainians wanted these natural gas permits. And he said, I will give you the natural gas permits if you give me the Ukraine funding. And it didn't end up happening, but like you can see, like it could just be used as like a negotiating chip. And so there's even another probability that it could be permitted in a future administration, even it's like President Kamala Harris. So you can see the odds of these terminals being permitted, even if the bill doesn't pass, is like that's like the odds of them not being permitted is pretty low. The odds of being permitted is pretty high. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But now let's go to the impact assessment of their emissions from Jesse Jenkins, Princeton Zero Lab. So another thing to bear in mind is that even if they receive a permit, it doesn't guarantee that the facility will be built because there are a bunch of facilities that have already received permits that haven't been built yet, and there's only so much gas demand. And so it's not in the oil and gas industry's interest to like build oversupply and overcapacity, because then that can be a stranded asset, or it can, like, if you have too much LNG exports, it can decrease the price of LNG and that hurts their profits. So that's another thing to bear in mind. But Jesse Jenkins did a very conservative assumption. He said, let's assume because of this bill, all of these LNG export facilities are permitted. They're permitted because of the bill, and meaning like if the bill didn't pass, they wouldn't have been permitted, which again is not very likely. And we'll assume that all of the gas that they export is added. It doesn't displace any gas from any other sources, which is also not very realistic, but he's trying to create the upper bound of like how much potential impact could this possibly have on the climate. So he notes the scales of the effects estimated in his analysis are likely larger than the actual real world impact of approving all pending terminals. So basically it's like what he's estimating is bigger than what the bill will actually do. So then he looked at like different factors, and he looked at worst case and best case. And so one factor is how leaky is US natural gas infrastructure, because it leaks so much methane into the atmosphere. If it's very leaky and we expand LNG exports, that means you're exporting more gas and you're having more methane leakage, and that's bad. That's your worst case if you keep lots of methane leakage. And then in the US, since we're exporting more of our natural gas, we're increasing, we have less natural gas to use in the US, so we're decreasing the supply, so we're increasing the price in the US, which then means we're going to use less. It's going to increase the price, or it's going to decrease the demand. And if we're using less natural gas, something has to replace it. In a worst case, coal replaces it. We just keep burning coal for longer. So that's your worst case there. And then the LNG exports going to other countries are going to displace something. So they could displace coal, they could displace other natural gas sources, they could displace clean energy. So like, for example, we send gas to Japan and they burn that gas instead of building more solar power, for example. So that's the worst case, is if they're burning gas instead of building solar power, for example. So those are the worst case scenarios. I needed a best case scenario because we have EPA regulations on methane leakage from oil and gas coming very soon. We have the Inflation Reduction Act's price on methane pollution that is going to be like the teeth, where if companies don't meet the EPA regulations, they have to pay that methane price. And so there is a very good possible scenario that we reduce our methane leakage in the United States. I would say not only is that best case, I think that's a pretty likely case given the EPA regulations and the price on methane pollution. And then we could replace, if we're burning less natural gas, we could replace that with clean sources like solar and wind and batteries. Again, I would say that's the likely scenario, because especially if we pass this bill and we're able to build more transmission and clean energy, that's what we're going to mostly build. So again, I think not only is that the best case, it's the most likely case. And then our exports, it could be that we send liquid LNG to other countries, and instead of burning coal, they burn that natural gas. And so they're burning less coal, and that's the best case because it's less emissions. Again, I think that's pretty likely to happen because like everybody's trying to transition away from coal right now. And then gas and coal are both similar base load sources of energy. So like, again, I think not only is that the best case, it's probably the more likely case. But in any case, that is your best case assumptions. And so we modeled all this like world of possible outcomes, worst case to best case. And basically, Jesse found that best case, we reduce our emissions by about 4% of our 2030 to 2050 total emissions if we're doing all that best case stuff. If those worst case assumptions happen, then you increase your emissions by about 5% from 2030 to 2050. So it's somewhere between a decrease by 4%, increase by 5%, probably pretty close to zero. I think more likely on the negative side, because as I said, I think the best case assumptions are more likely, but probably pretty close to zero net effect on the climate. And then RFF modeled the onshore oil and gas provisions, except they basically looked, again, similar to Jesse, as like an upper bound scenario, not like exactly what the bill does, but like what is like the upper bound of what could happen. And so they basically said, let's assume that onshore oil and gas federal lease sales double. So you do twice as much acreage every year as you have been recently. And they note the bill provisions are likely to have a more modest impact, because the bill doesn't actually say we need to do that. But again, they're looking at upper bound. And they found that doubling leased land based on some research would increase emissions from our onshore oil and gas by about 25%. For a few reasons. One, because just because you auction the land doesn't mean the land is purchased. And if land is purchased, it doesn't mean that it is actually developed. Because oil and gas companies like to buy leases and then kind of sit on them and decide which ones to develop. But it takes, resources to actually like explore them and figure out if there's enough oil and gas there. So that's one factor. Also, if you do extract oil and gas from that land, like some of it is going to displace other sources of oil and gas from around the world, because there's like a fairly limited demand for oil and gas. And so you can't just like keep adding more oil and gas, because like somebody has to burn it. And so you put those together and it's about a 25% increase in emissions for a doubling in leased land. Third way modeled the offshore drilling, which was pretty similar, except that offshore drilling is more expensive. We do less of it, and so it has a smaller impact on emissions than the onshore drilling. And so overall, they said 1 to 4% increase in our 2030 to 2050 emissions. But again, that 4% is like if we double and keep our area of leased land doubled, which is not very realistic. It's just like an upper bound, so it's probably closer to the 1% end impact on our 2030 to 2050 emissions. So I had, of course, to put it all into chart form. So this is our emissions to date. If you kind of extrapolate our current trajectory forward to 2050, which is kind of the simplest assumption, for a business as usual, that's kind of our current path there in red. And then if you take out the kind of most likely emissions impacts from the bill from the chart we saw earlier, it looks something like that. And in a more like best case scenario, it's this light green line. And so the emissions reductions are somewhere in this range, in this envelope here. Most likely something like a 10% reduction, maybe a little more than that in our 2030 to 2050 emissions, up to a 25% reduction in our emissions if we get really aggressive and build lots of transmission, as we would be smart to do, but it's hard to predict if our transmission regions will all be smart and ambitious and forward-looking and actually do that. So somewhere in this range is the emissions impact overall of this bill, or at least the provisions that were modeled here. So just putting it all in numbers, the transmission is an 8 to 22% reduction in emissions. The LNG exports are roughly 0, but minus 4% to 5%. Oil and gas is 1 to 4%, but probably more like 1%. So in total, you're looking at something like 1% to 25% reduction in our total 2030 to 2050 emissions, most likely in the ballpark of 10%. One caveat is that I keep talking about 2030 to 2050 because the bill doesn't have much impact before 2030, because it still takes time to like do transmission rules and planning, and you still have to do the permitting, even though permitting is faster, and then build it. So it's not a big impact by 2030, but it is big, as we saw, by like 2040, 2050. Like then you start to get big emissions reductions. Also, like they didn't model every single provision in this bill. Like they didn't model the technology specific reforms we've talked about previously, including like stuff to give geothermal activities on federal land, exploratory drilling, categorical exclusions so that we can get geothermal power going faster, and the geothermal land lease sales that are going to be allowed by this bill. And nothing about like hydropower potentially growing as well. So they're only looking at like the transmission and the fossil fuels and not like this other geothermal hydroelectricity, and some other like there's like categorical exclusions for like improving transmission line technologies and things like that. So everything we talked about, like it's not all inclusive, and like so the emissions reductions could even be a little bit bigger than what we're talking about. Although like the big thing is the transmission lines, so it's not going to be a whole lot bigger, but it could be a little bit better. And then, of course, we have the environmental justice concerns. Lots of environmental groups have come out in opposition to the bill. One complaint that they have is that they haven't had a seat at a negotiating table, which is a perfectly valid complaint. I mean, one issue is that basically nobody has had a seat at this negotiating table. It's kind of been negotiated by senators and their staffers behind closed doors. But their concerns are that fossil fuel infrastructure will be allowed to be built more easily, and then that's going to create local air pollution and impacts on frontline communities, which is certainly a valid and reasonable criticism and concern to have. I would also note that like this bill doesn't impact the environmental assessments that still have to be done as part of these permitting processes. So like federal agencies still have to like look at the environmental impacts of these projects proposed on federal lands and make sure that they like aren't unreasonable. So those kind of things still happen. One thing we would like to see that I think environmental justice groups would also like to see is like more community involvement provisions in this bill. So we are certainly like our staff is looking at things that could be included and amended into this bill that would make it better, that would still like not tank its chances of getting bipartisan support and votes and passage. And community involvement, I think, is one potential area where we could improve the bill. So we're going to be looking into that. So we'll see if we can make some progress there potentially. I think it's also important to bear in mind like a large picture that like there's also existing fossil fuel power plants in place right now where frontline communities are breathing that air pollution. And the faster we can build this clean energy and replace and retire those fossil fuel power plants, the better it is for those frontline communities. And also a lot of these frontline communities in places like Louisiana and coastal Texas are very vulnerable to climate damages from like sea level rise, extreme hurricanes, extreme heat. And so like it's also to their benefit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. So just like a lot of things to like bear in mind as we're evaluating these impacts of these bills. And also, as I noted, like most of this infrastructure will probably be built anyway. Like, remember the first Manchin's first permitting reform bill had the Mountain Valley pipeline, and like it got a lot of opposition for that for good reason. Like there was didn't belong in there, to be blunt. But then the bill didn't pass. The Mountain Valley pipeline got built anyway, and we didn't get any of the good stuff in exchange for it. So like if the fossil fuel infrastructure is probably going to be built anyway, which is largely the case, like there's a good case to be made for getting something good in exchange. So it's just another thing to bear in mind. Also, just like we're at a point where we need to approach this from like a more demand side mindset, I think, because blocking fossil fuel projects isn't sufficient to solve the climate crisis right now. And also bipartisan bills need compromise. Also, we still do need some fossil fuels because we still have a bunch of gasoline fueled cars. We have gas powered buildings and industry. Like we're trying to transition away from that as fast as possible, which this bill will help to happen. But like we can't just shut off the taps immediately. Like we do still need some fossil fuels for a while. And so I like to say like the solution is to bury fossil fuels in an avalanche of clean technologies and like get as much clean technologies, solar, wind, batteries, EVs out there as we can, so we can replace the dirty technologies and solve the problem that way. And again, like the net impact on the climate is like the key question that we're trying to answer. And according to this analysis, the net impact is good. And then again, thinking of like that supply side mindset, like just trying to stop fossil fuel projects. Like this is oil production by region. This is North America, which is mostly the United States in red here. So you can see like even if we could reduce North American oil production, like other countries, especially the Middle East, could pick up that slack. And then globally, it wouldn't make a big difference. Similar for natural gas, we do produce quite a bit of natural gas in the US, but so do other countries. And so like even if we could reduce US gas production, other countries could pick up that slack and that wouldn't solve the problem. And then you can see what's been happening in the US with oil production. It's this line right here that's been going up and up and up over the past decade plus as like fracking has gone into effect, and even with like climate friendly administrations and efforts to stop pipelines and things like that, our oil production has gone up really fast. So has our gas production gone up really fast. And in fact, the Biden administration recently, the other day, tweeted this, bragging that our average monthly US energy production, which is mostly fossil fuels, has grown over the past 3 to 4 years. In the debate, Kamala Harris said something similar. And so like, even though these are climate-minded, relatively politicians, like they're still bragging about our oil and gas production. And so like just trying to stop our production is just not sufficient. We have to actually decrease the demand and solve the problem more that way. The good news is we're making progress there. This is a chart from McKinsey projecting fossil fuel demand into the future. Coal has probably already peaked and will be going down quickly. Oil is about to peak as countries transition toward electric cars, especially, and that will go down as we accelerate this transmission to electric vehicles. Natural gas will go up slowly and then probably peak within the next, decade or two. And so, again, that's why companies have to be careful not to build too much natural gas export facilities because that demand's not going to be there forever. And in fact, there is a projection from ING Research that the supply here in gray of LNG exports is going to exceed the demand very soon because there's so much of these LNG export terminals being built. And again, that's not so good for the oil and gas industry because then if there's too much supply, then prices go down, profits go down, and that wouldn't be smart. So the way to accelerate this is to accelerate the transition away from natural gas by accelerating the transition to clean energy, which helps the energy permitting reform act will help do. And then I think it's useful to bear in mind that that approach has been successful. So I've shown this chart before where this red line is our climate path before the Paris Agreement was signed. We were headed for 3.5 degrees Celsius, this kind of catastrophic level of warming. We are now on this blue path, which is based on current policies. We're headed towards more like a 2.5 degrees Celsius world. So we've already erased a degree, just not enough, but we're making progress. And that progress has largely come from solar panels, wind turbines, and electric cars deploying clean energy technologies. So the more we can accelerate that through permitting reform, the more emissions we can reduce and get onto a safer climate path. And again, there's this worry that like if we just reform permitting, then like, how do we know that clean energy will win? Well, clean energy is winning already because it is the cheapest source of electricity. This is the levelized cost of energy from Lazard. Blue is wind, yellow is solar, gray is gas, and black is coal. You can see the cheapest ones are already wind and solar, and if you include the subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, the tax credits, then it becomes even cheaper. And so, like, most of what we're going to build, if we get faster permitting, is wind and solar. And in fact, that's what we have been mostly building. This is like what's been built and what is projected to be built in the United States. In terms of power this year, you can see it's mostly solar power, battery storage, wind, and a little bit of natural gas, also a little bit of nuclear. But the vast majority is solar, battery, and wind because it's cheap and clean, and that's what's winning out. So that's what will generally win out with permitting reform. And we've also seen a success in Europe, in Germany, and when they passed permitting reform. So this is a chart from Bloomberg looking at the amount of wind and solar built in various European countries. You can see Germany passed some permitting reforms here. And then a few years later, their wind and solar deployment accelerated really fast, which has not really happened in their peer European countries. So it kind of shows that permitting reform works pretty well at getting clean electricity deployed, clean technologies deployed. That's kind of a real world example. Germany's permitting reform wasn't exactly the same as what we're proposing here, but it did have some of the similar like transmission provisions, for example. And so kind of shows that if we can build our transmission lines faster through permitting reform, it will succeed at building faster wind and solar the way Germany did.
Yes, absolutely. First and foremost, thank you all, and Dana, for all of the great research. I know that all of you that are still hanging here with us, all 122, are just doing some of the most essential work across the country with your leadership in CCL and beyond within the climate movement. So thank you for your time. Please join me again in just thanking Dana for all of the preparations and the explanation and the Q&A to making this very complicated, very nuanced bill more accessible. We certainly know that we're not fully there in the download, but we're a little bit closer as of this hour together. So please continue the conversation in the forum, cclusa.org/forums. Know that we so appreciate all of your engagement, your ongoing discussion and advocacy across this and all of our policy agenda. And I'm going to unmute all lines here to just have us all be able to sign off tonight. And
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.